and welcome to our third episode in Season 2 of the History She Wrote book club. This time, we're tackling the Szpiorsky book, The Beautiful Mrs. Seidenman, about a group of Poles living under Nazi occupation in 1943 Warsaw. Today, we read up to page 127, and if you'll remember at this point, Mrs. Seidenman has been arrested. Henio has disappeared. Henio's father is calling Judge Bromniski for an as-yet unnamed favor, and we met Sister Veronica, who brought Jewish children into her orphanage to hide them from the Nazis. We also found out that the tailor Kujawski is the most celebrated creator of trousers amongst the Nazi occupiers. And just as we said last week, we are not avoiding spoilers. The entire book is a spoiler. It's impossible. Luckily, the beauty of The Beautiful Mrs. Seidenman is not in plot twists, which surprise the reader because it really doesn't leave room for any plot twists. Rather, the book gives voice to the stories we already vaguely knew. The first thing we learn in this week's reading is why Jerzy Fichtelbaum phoned the judge. The final liquidation of the Warsaw Ghetto was imminent. We already knew this was coming. History exists, after all. But we also know that Jerzy himself is unable to be saved. We know his fate is to die, as was Henio's. What we don't know is the fate of Jerzy's young daughter, Józia. Her fate is precisely the reason Jerzy calls his old friend the judge. The call gives the judge a sense of purpose he didn't realize he had lost. It gives him something he can do. He can figure out how to save this child, and he does. But more on that later. First, the book pushes us forward in time so we can see that the judge indeed survives the war, only to be put into prison by the Soviets and the communist Polish government. We saw that this man of tremendous culture, who gathered himself to rise to the occasion and rescue the only remaining child of his pre-war Jewish friend, would be released from prison in 1956 and die in a poverty-stricken village in the house of the one distant family member who could be convinced to take in a released convict. But we also learned that he would always remember his role in saving Józia, that it fed his sense of justice and Polishness as a whole, and that, indeed, it was most likely what kept him alive through prison torture and hardship. Jerzy leverages an old client to get Józia out of the ghetto, a criminal named Viktor Suchowiak. Viktor turned out to be the perfect man to smuggle out a young child. Not only was he paying Nazis to look the other way on a regular basis, but when threatened by yet another criminal who made his living by finding hidden Jews, Viktor quickly beat the crap out of him and safely delivered Józia to her safe house, which happened to be with none other than Pawełek and his mother. We also learned the chain of events that resulted in a team being assembled to spring Mrs. Seidenman from the Gestapo headquarters on Schucha Street. Her rickshaw driver, convinced she could not possibly be Jewish, alerted her neighbor, Mr. Korda. Mr. Korda, also convinced Mrs. Seidenman could not possibly be Jewish, contacted Pawełek. Pawełek contacted Mr. Filipek, whose life had been saved by Dr. Seidenman many years before. And Mr. Filipek contacted his friend Johann Müller, a Polish patriot of German descent. The importance here is not how the story unfolds, but rather how it perfectly illustrates the web of obligations, absurdity, and sense of Polishness that make up the very fabric of Polish culture. Because Jerzy, who argued before a particular judge, defended a certain criminal, his daughter was saved. Because Mrs. Seidenman's beauty had captivated some, and because her husband had saved others, she too would be saved. But it wasn't just obligations that led to these events. It was the sense of a communal feeling of Polishness, of Poles against the invading Germans. Finally, it is in this chapter that we learn the past and ultimate fate of the tailor Kujawski, known for his perfect trousers. Kujawski received his initial apprenticeship through Judge Rumniski, who recommended him to a Jewish tailor named Mittelbaum. Overcoming his initial objections, Kujawski signs on and learns more than he would have at any other tailoring shop. Mittelbaum and Kujawski make more and more and more money, but as we know, evil is coming. When Mittelbaum and his family moved to the ghetto, they put everything into Kujawski's name, and Kujawski guards and grows this Jewish fortune. Long after he loses any contact with Mittelbaum and his family, who have all been killed, he tries to figure out what to do with the fortune he was given to hold safely. Just as he decides to create an art museum bearing Mittelbaum's name, Kujawski is grabbed in a sudden roundup on the street, taken to a prison, and shot. It's here that his story ends. The roundup that captured Kujawski was a common tactic used by the occupying Germans. It was called a łapanka, which was the name also used for the children's game we call tag in English. It's estimated that these łapanka, which reached their peak between 1942 and 1944, claimed the lives of over 400 Poles per day during this period. Not everyone rounded up would be killed. Some were transported for slave labor. And those lucky enough to be employed by the Germans might get released. But the random nature of these łapanka were the fear of Poles throughout the country. One never knew when they might occur, and avoiding them was as much luck as skill. Everyone knew someone, or several someones, who had been snatched up in a łapanka. Everyone knew someone who had been murdered in a łapanka. And while reading the book, The Beautiful Mrs. Seidenman, now we also experience the hopelessness and futility of someone we know and like being randomly rounded up and murdered. We're ending this week on the uplifting note of a rescued child and the horrible note of the łapanka. And all the while, Mrs. Seidenman is being held at the Gestapo headquarters. We will get into that next week when we read up to page 178. As a warning again, the unique style in which this book is written makes avoiding spoilers absolutely impossible. The entire book is a spoiler for itself. And if you love this book as much as I do, I highly recommend a tour of Warsaw with our Polish history expert, Marta. Marta can take you to all the sites in The Beautiful Mrs. Seidenman and tell you all the stories of a city reborn from its own ashes. It's all well and good to visit a city, but it's even better to understand it. And Marta is the perfect person to get you there. See you next week in 1943 Warsaw.
Oh, I love it!